material is that it's about time. It's about speed, it's about time running out, it's about deadlines, it's about how can we do things faster. So Eric, if I could start with you, can you give me some sort of idea about the scale of what we're talking about and the sort of timeline we're talking about if we're to actually mobilise the sort of money that we need?
Thanks. Helen, let me framing. I think we're going to move to Sadia and Terry are going to talk in terms of examples of how do you invest in impact, how do you create impact, and the fantastic examples like Pigeonly, like some of the things that Evan and others have been talking about earlier today. I think one of the questions, one of the challenges we know is that making their first investment is making the first investment is the challenge. And then the question is, what is the on-ramp to scale?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest challenges is, even if you can be really innovative, are you actually able to mobilize the capital you need to grow? Now my organization, which is called UNEP-FI, which is a long-standing partnership between the UN and the finance community. It consists of the UN working with mostly the larger banks, insurers, and asset managers globally. We just had our 25th anniversary last year, so we've been around for a long time. We've helped foster the development. The Principles for Responsible Investment was spun out from our organization 10 years ago. We have Principles for Sustainable Insurance, which was set up 6 years ago. So it's a lot about creating frameworks. And I think part of the question, as we see quite an uplift, I would say, in the impact space, in the sustainability space today, part of the challenge is how do we get to scale and how do we move from a traditional actor feeling they need to do some of this today because it's important for their CSR report. The expectations in society is that they should do something. But then, and one example would be the green bonds market, where there's been a real growth. It's been a fantastic story. But the reality is, a lot of issuers or investors, buyers on the buy and sell side in green bonds, they're doing a little bit of green and they're still doing a lot of brown. And global green bonds today, it's about 1% of the global fixed income market. So what about the other 99? And so the question of where we're looking at now is frameworks. And coming back to your question of where do we need to get to, generally what we see is that the need is to move now from the learning phase to the institutional wide phase. And whether you're a city group, a globally important banking institution, what do you do? You've tested out, you've done all of these things, but do you have the systems in place to actually say this is part of our actual corporate strategy? It's not our CSR strategy, it's part of our strategy going forward. And if we're going to have a fixed income, a debt portfolio, where do we see it needing to go in this space? And so when I come back to the impact question, do we see maybe a city doesn't invest in the first rounds of creating impact in a Pigeonly, but as it goes to scale, a Pigeonly goes to scale, let's say, the type of financing that we will require, who will provide it, and how will those institutions say we should be investing in many Pigeonlys? What does it take? Now, it takes leadership, it takes ambition. If you don't have that support from the top of these organizations, it won't go far. But just having someone say, yes, we should be active in this space, that doesn't add up to the total. So coming back to the big numbers, if we can talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is broader than climate. Climate is one of the 17 goals and probably is the most pressing one, or at least the one that has the most focus. But for the big picture in sustainable development, you might have heard this, we talk about $6 trillion a year is needed to help deliver the Sustainable Development Goals out to 2030. Today, if you add up the many pieces, maybe we're delivering about half of that, about $3 trillion, but there's a $3 trillion gap. And so the question, how do you fill that? And one of the discussions is, how do you bring financing to the sustainable development or impact market? And we'd basically say, well, no, how do you bring sustainable development activities to the financial markets? How can you make these activities, like working with Pigeonly's business model, how do you bring that to a financial market that actually puts value in what they're doing? And I think Evan was challenged with the question of what are your metrics when you invest? And he said, well, early on, it's very hard to have metrics. We look for values. We look to see that the company we're going to invest in, that there's a social contract that they see. But I think one of the challenges from a big institution, whether it's an investor or a lender or an insurer, is to say, how do we, how do we create a portfolio of Pigeonlys without having to understand the details of the needs. And when you think about the governments who came together to establish Sustainable Development Goals, did they have a pigeonly in mind? Probably they didn't. No, probably they didn't know how innovation happens, and that you can't predict exactly where capital is needed. So it's not about creating a taxonomy about these are all the good things and this is where we should put our capital. It's really about institutional systems and having, I would say, the smart institution who puts in place frameworks to be able to say, we are able to look for opportunities because we are able to value impacts. And
so we have two smart organisations here. So do you want to come in on this? So the timescales, how can we speed things up? How can we change systems and organisations so that they think in this way, that they're bringing finance to the goals rather than the goal? No, bring the goals to finance rather than finance to the goals.
So I can start off, but perhaps before I get to that, also talking about the bigger picture. I think when it comes to climate change and impact investing, there's some great news and then there's some bad news. The great news is we know what the goal is. It's a goal that the community has agreed on. We also know how much money will be needed. I mean, you talked about some numbers. There's another number that was put out there by Bloomberg last year that said it's roughly, in the next 25 years, you need close to 12 trillion to just meet the renewable goals, right? And there's a lot of money that is flowing into that space. I mean, you mentioned green bonds, but that's just one of the many mechanisms that have been put out there. There's a lot of money that's flowing in from the institutional world, so where the real money resides, into this space. The bad news is that it's not happening fast enough. So last year I was at the One Planet Summit in Paris, hosted by the French president. Then they've really taken on the leadership in this space and said, we want to be the place that brings together all of these ideas from the investment community and the NGO community and drive it forward. And if you look at all of the great examples that are being put out there, there's much more money behind climate finance than a lot of the other things that we were talking about earlier today. But it's just not enough. So I think the question then becomes, how do you take everybody and bring them together to say, let's do it at a faster pace. And let's not just focus on the renewable side, which is the easy thing to do these days. Nature is a big part of the answer, right? There was a campaign that Conservation International ran a few years ago, which was basically nature is 30. It's 30% of the answer when you talk about meeting the climate.
So it's a nature in the sense of like
nature
forests
and forests,
yeah.
like preserve them, restore them, preserve and restore your coral reefs and your mangroves and so on. And there's a lot of research that has gone behind it as well in terms of what the real value is. So with renewables, I think there's almost like a path to how you can invest in it, what the different products are and so on. When it comes to nature, there's harder work to do. And we all need to be doing it faster and better.
Who's doing that work?
Well,
funny you should ask.
I don't know if we'd frame it quite that way at the Global Green Grants Fund. And I do want to say I think I'm a bit of an outlier here at this conference and on the panel, because we're a relatively small fund, although we've been around for 25 years. We're a grant-making charity. We make very small grants to grassroots groups all around the world. So our average grant size is about $5,000. And what I wanted to say very briefly is that I felt the description for this panel was somewhat misleading. I mean, absolutely, and I want to commend The Economist for doing great coverage on climate issues, and I'm very happy to be here. But when we immediately say governments are not going to take care of the problem, so that means that impact investing is, I think it's just a false solution. We absolutely have to get governments to take responsibility for this. So some of the grants that we make are actually putting pressure on governments we fund in 168 countries around the world, and we're funding resistance, we're funding protest. We're also funding mangrove restoration. We have a network of advisors all around the world and we believe that local knowledge is the best knowledge, that the experts at the local level actually have the solutions. Now, obviously, there's a great need for mitigation around the climate crisis. But the fact is that in most of the world, people are just adapting, and they're adapting at the community level. So while I agree with the scaling comments that you've made, I actually think that the whole area we've been forgetting is the most local level, the most grassroots, the most community. And I just say that for a bit.
Just give me an example of the sorts of grassroots projects.
Well,
what can you do with 5 grand?
yes,
What does
we
it buy
make
you?
about 1,000 grants a year. We're kind of a wholesale grant maker in that regard. But we funded a group called Voices of Women in the Maldives. So that's an island communities. And it's to do a radio show and a social media campaign to inform people about the risks of climate change and to help people to know what, and especially women who are more impacted by climate change. And I know we have another panel on this, but it's on women and not necessarily climate.
Right, so worth mentioning.
Yes, yes. We've also funded the Arab Youth Climate Movement. That movement is in 15 countries in the Arab world. Our most recent grant was in Lebanon. And we funded in 4 countries, and also it's around communications and media and workshops and training.
This strikes me as there's a place here for that being a moderator between the people who need to put pressure on governments to make governments do things. And I would have thought this is very important in the nature area.
Yes.
I mean, it's governments who are able to make national parks and reserves.
Right. Although we work at the intersection between people and the environment.
Sure.
So just to say that people live all around the earth and people are going to need the environment in the future. And so we can't leave them out. A national park is not a solution.
Sure.
In fact, indigenous people are stewards of vast swaths of forests and so on. So we fund things like helping an indigenous group to map its region so that it can protect that swath of forest. So I'm just saying that a lot of times in impact investing and talking about scaling up, maybe we should be thinking outside the box in a very different way about where does the scale start, which is not to say that we don't want these groups to interact with each other, learn from each other, grow in their power. One last, for the moment, example I'll give is of a lawsuit that we helped to support, and it's through our Children's Trust. Some of you might have heard of that, but and it's basically was Juliana versus the U.S. District Court in Oregon, and it's a group of largely indigenous, largely Native American youth who are saying that because of the government's actions, their future is compromised, their possibility of life, liberty, and livelihood in the future. And so I think there's also a whole legal strategy that needs a lot of investment.
We may come back to the legal. Oh, so do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say I agree. I agree that it's not a matter of, does the solution reside in the private sector? Does the solution reside in the public sector? Does the solution reside at government level or at individual level? I think it's more a question of how do you bring everybody together so that you can actually get these solutions that are grounded, with all of these stakeholders implemented at scale. Because we cannot talk about the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement with any credibility unless we talk about scale. So I agree that everybody needs to come together, but it's one area where I think if we do things at a smaller level, then we're going to get to the year where we'll turn around and say, okay, what happened to the world around us? More desertification, more droughts, severe flooding, all of these things, and then it'll be too late. So I think there are creative ways of doing that. I'll just give a couple of examples where I think, it's representative of how you can bring all of these sectors together. So there's something called the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. It is an idea that came out of the UN world 2.5 years ago from UNCCD, where they said, we know desertification is a massive problem. It's a massive problem globally. Every year, the equivalent of half of the size of UK gets desertified, which is land you cannot put to productive use. And when you think about how many more people are being born and what we have to do, there's a massive disconnect there. And the thought was, okay, we know it's a problem. We know what some of the solutions are. They're proven scientific methods that you can deploy to take land that has been, desertified and get it rehabilitated. So let's create an investment fund. And, let's aim for something big. Let's put $2 billion as the number out there. And what we did at the Rockefeller Foundation was we gave them a grant to do the product design, which is what we do when it comes to a lot of this question about financing, and financing not in the millions, but in the billions and trillions. We said, okay, there's a grant. Let's figure out what that mechanism looks like or needs to look like. What are the projects? How are you going to get them online? Where is this fund going to live? How are you going to make it attractive to the investors? Which led to the creation of what's now called the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. So it's a blended finance fund, which is similar to what Deborah was talking about, but at a global scale. I mean, to date, it has gotten investment capital from some of the leading DFIs, which is to take more of the first loss positions in there, but it's gaining momentum. And the thing that I want to put out there is it's grounded in the science, it's grounded in the realities on the ground and where impact needs to happen, but it now has a professional fund manager. It's Mirova, that's the fund manager. It's one of the companies that Natixis has on their platform. And they're real projects that are getting in there. I mean, that for me is an example of how you can bring everybody together to do these things and do them impactfully. I'll just give one more anecdote to a meeting I was at recently. It was a lovely conversation. Around the table, there was the head of a European pension fund, there was the head of a leading NGO that works in the conservation space, and then there was the head of one of the fund managers, one of the big ones. And we were all having a conversation about what needs to happen, because I think if you look at it from the individual point of view, everybody says, okay, we're willing to engage. And the thing that it comes back to is, where is the product that we can all, like the NGOs can stand behind, the pension money can flow into, and a fund manager can responsibly go and execute on it. And I think that's one of the critical things that we have to figure out if we truly want to get to scale. And that's the role that we think philanthropy has to play in the mix, which is let's lead the R&D and development of these products so we can do what the financial community needs in order to be able to invest, but ensure that the impact is there for the individuals and for larger society.
It strikes me as very important what governments do. I mean, to take a very obvious example, it was governments who put together the SDGs with a lot of input, obviously, from civil society around the world. And I've been surprised at the extent to which it has shaped the way companies have thought. I did think they were going to come, be a bit eye-washy and like 17 of them and many, many sub-goals and so on. But actually, companies really are using them as a framework for thinking about what they do. And it's an example, I think, of how, if you talk about the natural environment, it's governments who are going to have to do stuff there, a lot of it. How do you get governments to take that sort of role and to speed up on it too, because the SDGs is a bit slow?
I mean, if I could come to that, first of all, I would challenge a little bit. I don't believe governments sign the SDGs, and I mean, coming from the UN perspective, and I would say maybe the Paris Agreement is an easier one.
Yeah, okay.
Sure, governments signed the Paris Agreement. The reason they signed was because civil society and the private sector were on board.
I don't disagree with that at all.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely not at all, but it is governments who then signed it.
Absolutely.
So how do you get governments to do things and do it faster?
It's this triangulation network effect. The sense, the governments, their biggest fear if they sign up to Paris is they go home and the headlines in the newspapers were, your government signed up to a job killer.
Right.
Rather than, governments have signed up to the new economy. Yeah. And I think in the lead up to Paris, that worked very well, and the investment community, as other parts of the private sector, played a very supportive role. I think civil society has for much longer been playing their role, but now we see industry stepping up. And I think it's this network effect, and what we hear, particularly from the mainstream institutions, the reason they do something is because they're hearing it in a soft way from regulators, from their customers, from civil society, and they just connect the dots and they say, well, this is where things are going. You have political cycles, you have other things that go up and down, but the longer term, the trajectory is that this is about the new markets and sustainable development. More broadly, this is the new currency. Impact is at the center of creating new market opportunity.
So we've got a good question coming in. It's actually typing as I'm reading it. So, so government is an essential partner in this effort, but it's compromised by a political communication problem, the millions who don't believe in climate change, and how to break through that wall of denial on a large enough scale. Thoughts from my panelists?
Well, I think this is a U.S. millions of people, and I don't even know if it's millions. But in much of the world, they're living with climate change. They're living with deforestation and an encroaching desert and so on. So,
but still, what the U.S. does matters. So, how do you cut through this?
Yes.
Opportunity.
What do you mean?
is that there are opportunities to invest in, the new economy.
Right.
And that, it's once people start making money, and as we, investment bankers around the world coming back to green bonds, all of a sudden, every investment banker, I would say generally, even here in the US, if they're not doing green bonds, they're aware of them. Why are they aware of them? Oh, you can make money from green. And I would say, if you posit from, to say that, addressing climate change is really about, the largest private sector investment opportunity, for the coming decades or millennia, I think that's where you start to
But
change.
you can make money from green bonds because governments subsidise wind power and solar, and they do that because they believe in climate change. So, you can't just say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if nobody believes in it.
Yeah.
You can make money from it.
But if you do the math, it's very hard to see that government action won't happen. And there are very few, well, it's in terms of multinational corporations, they don't look at any one politic. They see what's going on around the world, and they say, well, things are going to go up and down, but the overall trajectory is market growth.
Sadie, you want to
Helen, you can also look at it from a risk point of view, right? There's the opportunity point of view. There are these products out there you can make money. If you look at it from a risk point of view, I think there's something that happened last year which was really interesting, where Moodys put out a statement that said that governments that do not have effective climate mitigation and adaptation strategies in place may have their rating downgraded,
right.
Which means that their cost of going out and borrowing capital is going to become higher. So all of a sudden there's somebody who understands that risk. It may not be governments, it may not be the citizens, but if you start seeing it affect you in a way where the financial community is saying this is not good enough, then you're going to see change. I'll give you another example, and that was the wildfire situation that keeps repeating itself in California, right? Year after year after year, and it keeps getting worse. And the numbers in terms of the economic impact has gotten higher as well. There's somebody who raised the question the other day that said, won't you get yourself to a place, which I think will happen soon enough, where if you don't fix the problem, the insurance companies are going to say, we're not going to insure your businesses. We're not going to insure your properties because it is just not the right way to be operating. And then you end up in a position where you, as a government, and California is not an example of that, but as some of the other, federal level or otherwise, may just end up being forced to do something about it. So there's the ideology, there's the political belief, there's all of that, but at some point in time, there's the market that can come and push and say, this isn't good enough.
So we have another question in on the app, and I think it's one that I was going to ask myself, so it's clearly an extremely good question. If 30% of the problem is preserving nature, how can this be done without government action? I mean, basically land use is a government's prerogative in most of the world, or at least it's a government's prerogative to shape it, and should be. How can you get governments to, make decisions that involve, for example, just saying we're never going to develop here?
Well, I wanted to say something that in a sense relates to this and is also a response to something that Eric said.
Okay.
When we talk about the new economy, I think we need to think in terms of new paradigms. Sometimes they call it the just transition. There has to be a new way of thinking.
Just as in justice.
Justice, yeah, but along a whole range of issues, and nature is a part of the just transition. And what I would call a false solution are, for example, some of the carbon markets, none of which have really made it. But this idea that, the way to preserve nature is to attach some very specific value to it, or the RED program. So there's a way in which we need to think about our future and the world altogether differently. And companies can do this as well, because it can be a part of companies' missions, and that's where then the impact investing could be, where sustainability or valuing nature is a part of that company's mission. And we have a partnership with the Aveda Corporation, which is environmental sustainability as a part of their mission. They're very careful about where they source their ingredients. And then we make grants in communities around where they're sourcing their ingredients and so on. Then civil society is putting the pressure on government. I mean, once again, I think that's the way it's always been. The problem of dictatorships and authoritarianism and all of that is another problem that's not in our scope today. But.
Of course, yes, yes. Well, I mean, governments aren't all so easily to pressure.
Right.
If I can come in terms of the question of role of government, there's hard regulatory approaches, and there's soft. And I think the relationship between public and private and civil society playing a role in that is showing how soft regulatory action is actually getting quite a bit of traction. And we have some, people might know the Bloomberg Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures it's under the G20 process, so it's voluntary. And it's interesting what we're seeing within our members, the big banks, insurers, and asset managers. They don't see that this is voluntary. They see, because the regulators are talking about it and their customers are talking about it, they believe and they understand that now they need to start disclosing on climate risks. And interestingly, the recommendations under this task force very explicitly say it's not about only disclosing on historic backward-looking risks, it's about transition risk, which means predicting how your customers are going to change. The automotive sector, who are the winners of tomorrow and how does that impact on your credit risk? So all of a sudden, you see huge changes in the financial industry. Regulators played a soft role because they commissioned this group of private sector actors to get together, but they haven't had to regulate it. And so I think there's a very important role for government, but it doesn't always mean coming in and having the stick. Sometimes the carrot or the relationship can go a long way to enabling a lot of action. And certainly in Europe, we're seeing some very strong examples where the European Commission is basically asking the finance industry to tell it how to make its financial system more sustainable and preparing, follow-on actions, legislative and otherwise, to basically show that governments are willing to listen to industry and therefore regulate or operate in a way that makes sense for mobilizing investment rather than very inefficient ways. Now, sometimes you will always need to get governments to come in with a stick. And I would say, coming back to the land issue, land tenure, in some ways, if you don't have the rule of law in terms of who owns and how you get clarity, how can you get farmers to actually start to invest or to be in a position to invest in new forms of livelihood, et cetera. And there are many more examples.
I think also sometimes perhaps the action that you need from government is that they're willing to just come to the table. Perhaps it's not a stick, perhaps it's not a carrot, perhaps it's just the fact that they own the land or the natural infrastructure. And you can't go and put any solution in place unless you have them at the table. I'll give another example of one of the things that we're funding. It's a reef insurance product where we're working with TNC, so the Nature Conservancy, as well as the municipality in a part of Mexico, to say, you know what, a healthy coral reef has a massive impact on the local economy because it protects the local community. And that local community are hotel associations that depend on having a beach for their livelihood, but it's also all of the people that work in that area. So how can you bring together the government in that case, just because the Parks Department is responsible for maintaining the reef, but the hotel association that's responsible, that benefits probably the most, and the local community to say, okay, what is the structure you can put in place where there is enough money to take care of the damages when they arise, but as you're doing that, part of that goes to maintaining and restoring the reef as well. So I think in terms of how we've been thinking about the role of government when it comes to nature and climate, we need to adjust some of our thinking as well, because it doesn't always have to be a massive policy push, and it doesn't have to be something that's written into regulation. It could just be how they partner with everybody else.
One of the things that's come up for me in listening to this morning is I hadn't realised to what extent the law and insurance shape decisions, really huge impact. So I'm going to have to look into that more. So we have another question here from the app. In transitioning to a low carbon economy, how do you think about carbon reserve divestment? Can you invest in solutions while investing in companies responsible for extracting fossil fuels, given that our economy still relies on those energy inputs? I think somebody wants to be absolved, basically, but it's a good question.
Well, I think most of us know about the divest, reinvest movement. I mean, many of you here in the room are working in that. And it's not to say that every company that is into fossil fuels is not doing good things as well. But most of the groups that we fund believe that you need to keep the oil in the soil and you need to keep the coal in the ground.
But I mean, that said, here we all are, and we all got here, basically by using oil. So let's.
But we have to face. I mean, that was part of an earlier question. We have to face that then this transition is going to take place, whether it's after a huge number of crises, and when is a open. But
I mean, I think Bob Eccles over here, who's already spoken, but he's one of the visionaries, I think, around the concept of fiduciary duties and the notion of duty of care within the investment universe, to start to look at, for instance, carbon fossil reserves and basically say, do I have a duty to my customers, my pensioners, to actually take into account the fact that these fossil reserves might be overvalued, and to say, well, if you look at the Paris Agreement, 100 and so many 90 governments have signed onto it, probably you should take account, like now Exxon has, and other oil companies, because it's a possibility and an expectation of society to implement that low carbon trajectory. I think, unfortunately, as we know, there are many actors in the financial system. And there are investors, there are investment managers, there are consultants, there are advisors, there are accountants. And many parts of this industry are not yet on board. And we would talk about accounting standards. I think many people are familiar. There's no integration of, for instance, the Paris Agreement into accounting standards today. So when you value a fossil fuel reserve, do you need to take account of the expectation that the price of oil might link to government action on implementing Paris? Well, no, you don't today, because there's no standard. And the question of the duty of care of accountants, should they start to say, well, wait a second, maybe there is an impact, and maybe this IPO that's about to list based on a value of a oil price that goes up there, maybe that's not a responsible accounting action to say it's going. Maybe it'll go here or here. So I think it's a
So this is just part of a
I think
whole
it's
set of questions,
the
really.
types of stakeholders who need to play a role. We're seeing great change, but the reality is, I think we'd all admit that there's still many parts of the universe that need to change. Stock exchanges, another one, in terms of what are disclosure requirements. We've seen huge growth since Paris, basically, of stock exchanges putting in place voluntary and some mandatory disclosure for listed companies. And once again, if you start to get the information, you can let investors and consumers start to make educated decisions about whether they believe this carbon reserve is overvalued. But without the information, without the transparency, without, as some would say, if you buy a can of soup, you look on the back, you see what's in the can of soup. You have your pension. Can you see what's in your pension? Or in the U.S., your retirement savings. There's not a lot of transparency, so we need more of the information. Once that comes out, I think the carbon reserves, it'll be clear that this is a somewhat flimsy business model to expect that these reserves will be extractable. But as it stands today, a lot of people would say, well, the real hard-nosed business decision is nobody's discounting it, therefore the value's there and I'm going to extract it.
I'm going to take some questions from the room.
And if I could just add, if you don't already know the group Carbon Tracker, Mark Campanelli out of the UK, this is where you can get a lot of the information.
Great.
On what is the impact, what is it really worth,
So you know how much absolution you need.
Right.
We have a problem with climate deniers, which impedes government action. Those were my questions. And it strikes me that it's very difficult to break through the wall of deniers. And in a democracy, we cannot accomplish anything unless we do break through that wall. And I wonder if any of you have thought about or heard of other organizations that are interested in using the arts and entertainment industry to try to persuade people by entertaining them to get their attention and to expose the fallacy of climate denier, for example, by exposing the nefarious Koch brothers and other people who, for selfish reasons, are financing climate denial and actually, it's not the right word, but persecuting people who resist them, seeking to get professors fired from universities, defeat local candidates for office and so forth. Have you thought about that as a tool?
I mean, maybe more generally, sort of smart, no one policy is going to work for everybody, but smart policies for chipping away at this problem of climate change denial. Any thoughts?
There are a number of funders who fund at that intersection of climate and organizing. The Lambeth Foundation here in New York is one of them.
And what sort of thing do they do?
They would fund guerrilla theater, they would fund art exhibits, Actually, during COP21 in Paris, we funded quite a lot through 350.org of like posters that were up in the metro and other ways of educating people.
I mean, I would say an answer to you, and it's echoing a point that Sadia made, is it's not true that in a democracy you can't do things if there are people who want them done. There are other things. There's reality for a start. So, for example, a democracy might love you to just give everybody everything, but you can't because you haven't got it. Or a democracy might want you to do things that you just can't get insurance for, so you don't do it. So I don't think it's as bad as, well, there are climate change deniers out there, therefore on the path to perdition. If you can't get insurance for buildings if they're in a floodplain, or you simply just can't go ahead with a project because it damages other people's property rights, it's kind of moot whether people would have liked those projects. So that's where I put my hope more, I must say, than in changing hearts and minds of people who've now become very attached to an extremely polarizing issue. And it's polarizing not just about climate change, it's attached to people's beliefs about, power, how society should run. It's even associated with being against feminism, for example, even though they're not in any way clearly linked concepts. These have become culture war issues, and I think we kind of have to step away from the culture war rather than try and win it.
One thing to just add to this, and I don't know of any groups, and we don't fund anything in that space, but I'd say there's a very interesting debate going on right now around infrastructure investment in this country, right? And then if you read some of the recent articles that have been written, it's about how can you think about even building that infrastructure without taking climate change into consideration.
Exactly.
Like if you're going to go build a state-of-the-art thing and you're going to put it in a place where there's a pretty high risk of rising sea level, like you've already exposed that asset. If you're going to build a road and you're not going to use materials that would adjust to a 4% degrees increase in temperature, what good is that road going to be for you in 10 years? So there's the political ideology, I completely agree, but then there's the real world that also happens in that same conversation, where it may not be because you believe in climate change, but just because of everybody else telling you, you have to take these things into consideration. And in the foundation world, we call it building resilience, which is like building the capacity of society and individuals to adapt to whatever shocks and stresses come your way. And climate change is a big one.
Any more questions for our panelists? You can tell it's coming up to lunchtime.
Just a comment on, I mean, obviously, and I'm not an American, I'm a Canadian. I wouldn't purport to be an expert on politics here. I'm not sure who is these days, but it's a divided nation. And I think part of the challenge is both sides need to benefit from this transition. And I think one of the issues is, the side who supported the current administration, I think there's a broader view linked to maybe denialism that they won't benefit from this transition. And I think that's quite false. And you look at the state level, you look at like Texas, it's such a wind power today. And I think it comes back to the communications about how do you communicate with communities. At the community level, obviously, often it's easier to basically say, I mean, as a farmer, why wouldn't I want a wind farm or wind turbine on my land? This is opportunity. But when you aggregate it, the communication seems to get lost. And then you start to really have this bifurcation of views, which leads, I think, supporting the deniers, which we know it's the 1%, but when they get backing because of a broader political reason, that 1% can really block progress.
Mm-hmm. If I have one more question, I'll take one more question, and if not, I will... You have one. Sorry, I can't see over there. The light blocks me. Thank you.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for a really intriguing discussion here about these high-level issues. But at the risk of maybe ignoring some of the higher-level issues, maybe we could take this down a level and talk about technology, which is my interest. And I'm in the electric energy business. I'm very interested in clean electric energy generation. And so I see for me, the big four is nuclear, hydro, wind, solar. I'm curious what your reaction is, different panel members, to those four in terms of opportunity for either reducing, eliminating carbon emissions, or maybe even producing power that we can use to further reduce other carbon.
Great. Anyone like to respond?
I mean, I can start. Our view would be, and and I mentioned earlier, we're a little bit cautious about taxonomies, that one technology is good and another one is bad. We're more about having the capacities to be able to assess impact. And I say at the big institutional level that you should be able to look in the energy sector and say what type of investments are going to deliver what types of impacts, positive and negative, and based on that be able to make a holistic assessment. And we have a group of our members are working together, and they've launched something called the Positive Impact Principles, which essentially is a way to do extra financial analysis to be able to look at investments, for instance, in the energy sector, and to be able to start providing the metrics to say, on the whole, with regard to this sustainability as an opportunity, we see this investment, let's say, in renewables or in gas, probably not in coal, but that we can value it financially, but also extra financially in a way that we can make an investment decision. We believe that when you do early stage venture, as Evan said, it's hard to have metrics, but you have to be able to get to the point where you can start to do it. Because in a world politically where you say, this is the right technology, that's the wrong one, we believe that in the end, probably it's going to be more renewables and definitely less coal, but it's more the mindset of looking for impact and frameworks for creating impact that we believe is needed more broadly across the economy to actually create the changes that are needed at scale.
So I'm afraid it was a very high-level answer to a rather specific question, but I think it was a good one, and it was also a good one to finish on.